Okay, welcome to today's showcase. You might notice that it is in fact Wednesday when I'm uploading this. Maybe that's when I'm recording this. In case I don't upload it today though, it's probably either Friday or Saturday. But either way, today isn't a normal showcase day, and the reason for that is, of course, as you can see on the screen, it is not a normal showcase day. It is not a normal showcase in and of itself, that is. It is a code showcase, and I promised Zaz I would post another one. Said I would post another one anyway, and I do enjoy doing them, of course. But I recently had this huge breakthrough with some of the spell code and the projectile code specifically. So I thought, what better reason than to go over the spell code related to projectiles, and that way I can also kind of fit in a little explanation about what I did that made everything so different, because it is actually tied into what I'm going to be talking about today. So that's pretty cool. As per usual, or I guess as per the last quote-unquote episode, everything I'm going to be talking about here is really complicated. I will make some efforts to explain stuff, and I'll try to explain the function of everything so that you guys can understand. But if you're not really into coding or anything, don't expect to immediately get everything on screen. You're free to stay, of course. I'm not going to stop anybody. But I'm just warning you that for the most part, it's going to be a little bit difficult to follow if you aren't, kind of at least a little bit knowledgeable in that area. If you're new, just want to learn, feel free to tag along anyways, though. And for the most part, I don't have that many comments aside from here. Obviously, you can see quite a few, but I don't have that many comments for actual functions, so I'll do my best to explain those up front just because I know what they're doing. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start explaining the code. So, last time we talked about somewhat combat-related code, and I say that it's somewhat related because while it was health code, that's not actually what's doing a lot of the heavy lifting in combat, of course. That is literally how you take damage and deal damage, of course, but that's barely more than the backbone of a lot of this stuff. So just because you can do damage does not mean you can have cool ways to do damage, right? You just do the damage. It's very boring, not very exciting, and a lot of people wanted to see this specifically, but I couldn't do this without doing that, if that makes sense. Because a lot of the stuff here isn't going to make that much sense if not for that code. So this is actually pretty easy to understand. This is something I learned from Duel and a couple other people like Yina, is to comment these specifically, because you have so many different functions in your spells. Like some might be a channel caster, a charge caster, some might be a damage over time, or some might have a mana sustain or whatever else, right? So it's really important to keep these commented, and I don't have a lot of comments everywhere else, but because there are so many of these, and sometimes they have kind of confusing names like .tick quantity versus .tick rate, I know what that means, and I wouldn't need this comment right now, but in the future I might forget or something if I haven't been working on projectiles for a while, so of course I would want that comment there. So this is probably one of the most comment dense areas in all of my code, just so you know why I didn't comment all this right before the showcase. I just have these here. So to give you a little bit of an idea of what's going on here, all of these are basically setting up variables for the spells. So every spell has either one of these, or everything has to have a cooldown, of course, and most things have durations. Everything has a damage base of some kind, or a heal base, or a quantity. All of these things are set in stone. If you don't have damage, it won't do damage. If you don't have a heal, it won't heal. This multiplier here, this multiplier variable, is just if I want to add a quick damage multiplier or something like that. I'll show you why all of this stuff is important in a second, why or where it applies. Up here we have self-cast and flick-cast. What this does is if you are flick-cast, it casts you forward, so it puts you in the state of the cast state or whatever when you are casting a spell. Self-cast is the opposite. Self-cast means that you shouldn't have flick-cast applied, and in the future when we get that state made, that'll also be the case there. Or rather, it'll trigger that state instead of the flick-cast state. Spell user and spell target aren't really used anywhere, for a reason I'll list in a second, but essentially it's just the user and the target of the spell. Very basic. Ready to cast is also not used currently. These are overlay and underlay details, and these are very complicated. I'm not going to go over these too much right now, but just so you know, that's how that works, or what that's related to. And this will get a little bit more exciting in a second. I'm just going to go over some of these variables real quick. So next up is duration. Duration is, and quantity is, so I should state, well, something like cooldown, damage, or heal is a very self-explanatory effect. Quantity, duration, instant, a couple other of these things like mana cost, for instance, down there as well. These are all what I call implicit variables, or spell variables, term you want to use. Basically, they are not necessarily meant to directly implicate any certain purpose. So, for instance, damage base is obviously going to be damage. You really can't get away from that. And instead of using these down here, I've been a little bit of a bad boy, and I've used damage base instead of dot damage. And there's a couple reasons for that. I just prefer using it this way, but this is set up in the code, so I could put dot damage equals 10, and then when it hits the opponent, it will actually do dot damage over time. I just really don't feel like doing that. I prefer the other way, where I just apply the damage base several times. There's really no performance difference. If anything, I think it's more performant to do it this way, and I think it's a little bit more clear just because I understand what something's doing, but it's there if I ever choose to use it that way or refactor my other code to use it. Anyway, so that's pretty obvious. Cooldown you have to have, and that's always going to be seconds for the cooldown. Duration, and you can see here this is the default variable for cooldown, so if I've forgotten it anywhere, it's going to be 10, and most of the cooldowns are 10 anyway, so that's that explanation. Whereas duration can be any number of things, quantity can be any number of things. Quantity could be the number of extra lightning bolts that Thunderstorm produces aside from the randomly chosen ones, or how many times it hits an opponent, or how many times you launch out a projectile, how many projectiles you launch out at a time. They're implicit variables, like I said. They don't necessarily represent any solid thing, so that's why the comments they don't have comments. They're vague. Targeted, instant cast is for GCD, so if it's not meant to trigger GCD, then that's what that means. Targeted is if it requires a target to be cast. Spell range is the range in tiles before you can cast the spell, and density is just whether or not it will actually run into players. That isn't used. It's always 0 for projectiles. It can be used in a couple other places, like not all spells are projectiles, but for all projectiles, they are 0. So in cast down here, this is actually the wrong variable, so I'm going to quickly fix that. What time are we at? 7 minutes. Okay, that's fine. So I'm just switching that because I changed that variable name earlier, but anyway, this is just a function to cast, so anything that goes on top of the cast, like for instance, this triggers the mana cost. As you can see, it feeds in the spell's mana cost. This dot mana cost refers to, of course, up here, this mana cost. So if your mana cost is 10, it will send over to the user's on cast function saying spend 10 mana or whatever, and that just keeps this function a little bit cleaner. Same thing here, this just tells the user to flick cast if it's not self cast and if it is flick cast. These are just setting the spell variables, or spell user and target variables, and then cleanse is a little strange. You could argue that this should be on the user instead, but I figure that cleanse is sort of like a spell function instead of a player function, so that's just my logic there. Anyway, it just removes your debuffs universally, unless they're uncleansable, as you can see. This is a lot of crazy crap logic to apply layers properly with underlays and overlays, so I'm not going to go into that. That's a lot of different stuff, but down here you can see there's just some other stuff related to ending toggles when you log out, or when you are KO'd they should end the toggle, or when you're cleansed it sends this packet saying you've been cleansed, blah blah blah, all plenty of good whatever. So next up we have the actual spell file itself. So I'm going to quickly get this off the screen, not because it's bad or anything, I just want to focus on this one, and it distracts me a little bit. So this is Essence Wave, and I don't know if you guys remember Essence Wave. I would go in game, but no real reason to. It's not that crazy. It's just a wave. You fire it forward, it forms, and then it pushes back anyone that's hit, and then it does damage every time it hits them. So very basic, but that's the idea. So how does this work? Well, basically this is putting those spell variables into use. So you have the spell name here. You have this is the type of the spell, and that's how you grab the actual spell object itself. But it doesn't have to be Essence Wave. This could be anything. It's just easier to name it Essence Wave, obviously. This is the spell name, spell ID, spell description, spell type, and then these are unrelated. So these 4 variables up here, these are what the spell tree grabs, and what you grab in general when you need the spell info. So when you click on a spell in the spell tree, it grabs this info from the spell type. This down here is just for the icon. The atlas is where the icon is located, and then the icon is the name of the icon in the atlas, if that makes sense. Obviously we have damage base of 100, damage multi of 1, the duration is 2, which is how many seconds this lasts. Cooldown is 32, which is obviously the cooldown in seconds. Mana cost is 10, which will just be cast once, or rather subtracted once. And as you can see here, it's pretty basic. This is not necessary, this scale thing. It's actually a relic from when I first created this spell. But anyway, as you can see, we are creating a projectile here of the type movable projectile spell essence wave, and I'll get to that in a second too. It's producing it at user.xpax minus 16, and same for ypos. And then of course it puts it on the same map as well. So that'll be explained in a second. Basically it's just putting it there in that position on that map. It's really not that complicated, but you know, just to explain to you guys because you might not be familiar with the function. And then it sets that projectile's icon in atlas because we don't handle that in the projectile. It's a little bit more flexible that way, so we do have to apply it in the spell. But if I wanted to, I could apply it just directly to the projectile. That way every single essence wave always has the essence wave icon, but you know, sometimes it's fun to change that up, right? So sometimes you want to maybe use a different icon for the essence wave, or you know, this way it's a little bit easier to change because I just have to go to the essence wave spell, and then I would change this up here to whatever I want it to be, right? As opposed to going to the projectile spell and then making sure that this is correct as well. Anyway, you've probably noticed this line. This is a huge line, and this is actually something that needs to be refactored. As I said last time, I don't really believe in refactoring everything before showing it like this. I really don't think that's healthy for you guys in general, especially for other coders. You know, with the whole game crunch thing and everything, people are super cautious about their code, and everyone thinks that if you're a fantastic coder, you will just type out lines of gold. You'll just, you know, crap out these golden eggs constantly, which isn't the case, right? Just because you're a good coder does not mean that you will always produce fantastic code. And that being said, basically that's my excuse for not refactoring this. There's no real reason. It works perfectly fine. It just looks extremely weird because of how long it is. It is incredibly long, and the reason for that is because it's plugging in all of the different information that you need to construct a projectile. Like I said previously, this does exist, like this dot damage variable does exist and has a function, like it'll apply a dot on attack or on hit. But unfortunately, I don't use that, and therefore I'm kind of in a limbo about that. Like, I don't want to remove it because maybe in the future I'll want to make use of that function, but right now I don't, so it's kind of just dead weight in this function here. But, you know, that's kind of the debate you have to have with yourself sometimes. Anyway, we're going to go over here. So this is projectiles. I'm not going to go over this as much because it's very basic. Or it's not very basic, I should say, but it's basically the same thing as the spell projectiles. As you can see, I've kind of ordered the variables a little bit differently here. I'm not sure why this stuff was at the bottom of the spell file, but anyway, these have some other comments on them. You guys can read those if you want. Down here we have a bunch of different angles. These are related to trig. They're a very basic thing, but I'm not going to go over that too much just because I think it's a little bit more boring than what I have to show you otherwise. And yeah, so this is the actual deploy function itself. It sets up some of the angles. So for instance, the random angles are set to random angles, that function, as well as it sets the directional angle to the angle to your spell's target, your projectile's target. OG angle is set to their position, so on and so forth. Is just setting up the spell, basically. So you have all of this information available just to grab. Same goes down here. It sets the user and the target of the projectile, the duration of the projectile. If this variable is, if you want to set the projectile automatically to the user's direction, then that's what you would use. And that's usually the case, because if you're firing a fireball, you want it to always match the user's direction, obviously. The projectile type here is set to the spell type. That's the type of damage you're doing, so essence type or whatever else. Projectile damage is obviously equal to the damage base times the damage multi. And then here we have a bunch of different logic. I'm not going to go over this too crazily, but essentially it's just some logic to figure out what kind of hit type you want, and this relates up here. So if you have piercing, it won't die after a hit. However, it won't hit twice. If you want it to hit twice, you need multi-hit, and this will allow it to hit twice when it crosses with the target. If you want it to hit multiple times while still crossed with a target, you need to use projectile thread hit, which will create a thread, which is basically a timed loop every so milliseconds. So every maybe 500 milliseconds, you can have it hit the target. So that way, it doesn't need to recross with the target to hit it again, like go off the target and come back on again, or collide with it. It can just continue hitting it, which is what we use for AOE's. It's not really used that much for projectiles, but it's there, I guess. There's a bunch of different functions here. So, for instance, hit delay adds a delay between these hits or whatever, or a minimum delay, so it won't allow it to hit again until this delay is up. Hit thread is just a container for this variable's thread. Whole lot of stuff here. Not all of it is very useful, so don't worry about it too much. I'm just kind of explaining what these functions do here, or rather what these little snippets of code do inside this function. And then this is some detection, so it detects if there are any hurt boxes, which are just hit boxes for spells, and if there are any crossed with the current projectile, then it deals damage, and it triggers the on-hit function. This is the death timer, I think. Oh no, this is the dot timer. This is a little bit more crude. It's, as I said, unused, so I really haven't updated that at all. This is the actual duration thing down here. So that's that. I am quickly... we are approaching 16 minutes. I don't think you guys mind too much, though, if this goes on quite a bit, because if you're reading or watching these, rather, you're probably here to see all the code, so I'm not going to worry too much about the length of it. But this is a manager execute function, and I'm going to go quickly up here to managers core, and then we're going to go into game manager. So to explain what that function does, I'm going to go over this really quickly, but basically we have these event functions here, and these event tick functions as well. To put it simply, whenever you add an event to the manager, so when we want, say, a projectile to move, we would add it as an event to the manager, and then it loops through all of its events, and every event you add has a default tick rate. So say that you add a projectile with a tick rate of 2, right? So this thread runs every 50 milliseconds. Now, if you have a event tick rate of 2, that means that every 2 loops of the central loop here, it will execute whatever that manager execute function is of that projectile. So let's say that we have it move us forward 1 space, whatever that is, and we have an event tick of 2, which means that every 100 milliseconds we will move forward 1 space. This goes for everything in the game. It can be anything. Nodes are handled this way, projectiles are handled this way, AI is handled this way. Everything goes through this event loop. So very basic, and all of this stuff can be edited. So for instance, if you want to change the event tick, like maybe you want a projectile to suddenly slow down, you can have it move its event tick up higher, so you suddenly have a 5 tick rate, which means that you're operating at 250 milliseconds per tick, so on and so forth. You can also speed it up, blah blah blah. So that's the gist of that. It's not too complicated, but I felt like I should explain it, and not to patronize anyone that doesn't understand. It's not that big a deal, but anyway, so that's what this function does. And the reason I'm explaining that so in depth is because every single one of the projectiles uses this function, because they're all events and they all need to move, right? So what actually moves them is down here. These are all movement functions, as the comment says. They're all different types of movement functions, so it's a little bit complicated here, but most of them are pretty easy to understand. I would not look at lerp to target. I've been messing the crap out of this one. It is a huge mess right now, but you know, just so you know, it is right there. Anyway, these are all pretty basic. So here we have move xy. So this sets the position of the projectile to its current x position plus the x position you're trying to move by times the projectile speed. So if you have a projectile speed of 80 and you want to move by 1 of whatever that is, then you would basically just move 80, right? And that goes for y as well. Move to target is a little bit more complicated. It just moves you it homes you towards the target. Move to dir is, I need to change this actually, but move to dir is move to direction, and move to user dir is move to user direction, obviously, and that just uses the move to direction function with the user's direction. Those are pretty straightforward. You move north, south, east, west. Move to random is just a random move, and then lerp to target is, to put it simply, it just kind of gradually moves you from one direction to the direction that'll take you to the target, if that makes sense. The die function here is very straightforward. It's also a little bit messy, but essentially it deletes, or rather it doesn't delete, but it turns them invisible and undense. That's actually a relic. It should delete them. But I have it undeleted right now just because I've been doing projectile testing, as I mentioned in Verdict Chat. Anyway, the function here, induce damage. If induce damage is false, it won't do damage to anyone. Like, it won't be physically capable of actually damaging anyone. So that's that, very basic. But when it dies, obviously you don't want it to keep doing damage to people, so it takes that off. It removes the event from the manager, so it's no longer capable of moving, and it interrupts the thread for the actual, thing, for the ticks, if that makes sense. This is the on hit function. I'm going to try to speed up a little bit because we are at 20 minutes. But anyway, this is the on cross function. This is what will actually check to see if you should do damage to someone. So as you cross objects, it will check to see if there's a hurt box there. If there is, it'll do damage, and does a bunch of other logic that I'm not going to go into too much detail about. Basically, it checks to see if it's possible to hit this target, and if it should hit this target, and if it needs to die after it hits this target, or if it has multiple hits, or if it reached that multiple hit threshold, so on and so forth. Now I'm going to quickly try to go over Essence Wave down here. I've prepped it a little bit. This is another one of these no-nos. I promise you I will fix this as soon as possible. I just picked a spell randomly, so I understand this is a little bit ugly. I get it. This is very basic. Trust me. Anyway, that's just, I think it's the least clean part of the spell, but it was a good example to show off these. So when you deploy it, when you use this deploy function, if you remember up here, we just almost immediately hit deploy on the projectile. So as soon as you cast the spell, it deploys it basically, and it adds the event to the manager, which means that manager execute will run every 2 loops, so every 100 milliseconds, because that's the default for projectiles. Then you disallow the state change just because I don't want it to immediately swap to whatever direction the user turns to. And down here we have some very basic stuff. It's a very basic moving projectile. We just have it moving in a certain direction, and then as it moves, it slowly accelerates up to 70 movement speed, or 70 projectile speed, I should say. And this is just a lerp function to figure that out. So it goes from 5 projectile speed up to 70 at its max. So it's pretty cool. Up here, finally, we have these different variables. Basically, projectile speed, this is the base projectile speed, as you can see down here too, it's also 5. Piercing means that it won't die after a hit. Multi-hit equals 1. That might seem a little bit contradictory, but if multi-hit is 0, it only hits once. If multi-hit is 1, then it will hit infinite numbers of times. If multi-hit is 2, it will hit 2 times. 3, it'll hit 3 times. Does that make sense? So piercing is just to set it to not die after the first hit, and multi-hit is to allow it to hit multiple times. You don't need piercing if you have multi-hit necessarily, but I keep it just in case. Thread hit means that it also hits on a thread. So, pretty straightforward, and then this is the hitbox for it. Pretty straightforward. I hope you guys got the gist of that. That was a rapid pace one, I think. I tried to go a little bit fast with it because we were running out of time. But very straightforward stuff, I would hope. I don't think it's too complicated, and I hope you guys enjoyed seeing it. I know that I have some kind of inequalities, we could say, in my code, but just trust me that I will fix this, and also trust me that I haven't touched this code for a very long time, so that's that. If you are curious about why we were having that projectile issue, to put it simply, I'm not going to go up to the code just because it won't make that much of a difference, but I was using a unknowingly deprecated function called step pause, or step position rather, instead of set position, and there's very, very little difference between those two. The only difference is that step pause calculates collision. I should say that there's a lot of difference, just not in function. So for instance, step pause, if you try to step pause into a wall, it will stop you, whereas if you try to set pause on a position covered by the wall, it'll just teleport you onto the wall. So it doesn't have collision detection, but we don't need collision detection. These projectiles are all undense anyway, so there's no real reason why we would ever want that in the first place. Other than that, it's not that complicated. I did swap from on-cross to uncrossed, and the difference there is very minimal. On-cross basically waits for whatever code you have inside it to run before allowing the projectile to cross with whatever it's trying to, whereas uncrossed is called after it's already crossed. So previously, when a projectile would try to enter the space of a player, it would wait to check all of its logic for damage and everything else before allowing it to actually do that, which was causing a ton of lag, and it would also hang them up and everything. So that's been changed. Step pause also has all of that collision logic, which set pause doesn't. That way, that's also a huge motivator for performancy. There's a couple other things as well. Just a ton of crap that's been fixed. To give you guys a good idea, I actually, I was gonna maybe show you guys, but anyway, I was able to have up to 80 projectiles on the screen, with 40 being produced and 40 dying every single second, without any FPS drop. That is insane. Previously, I would have a FPS drop of even 15, 20 when I was simply casting Cavitation and it would hit an enemy. Now, obviously, that's so much better. That is incredibly so much better. And I'm really excited about that because it allows me to have a lot more room to work with spells. Obviously, if I want to have maybe a couple more bubbles and Cavitation for a balance thing or something, like maybe it's too easy to dodge right now, that allows me to actually have those extra bubbles, whereas previously I would have to take into account lag, which really sucks for game balance because it's like, logically I need to include these extra bubbles, otherwise it's going to be a little bit underpowered, but it's going to also make it more laggy, which is already kind of, not possible. So that's, something to consider. So yeah, and since you guys are the ones that stayed till the end, I'm going to show you guys the most complicated part of this. I'm not going to explain this that much because it's really complicated, and even for me, I hate dealing with it because it's so complicated. But this is client-side code. It's complicated because it's not very easy to see, but essentially whenever it gets an update, so like I was talking about earlier with the event loop, when it ticks, which is to say every time that it ticks for that specific projectile, which would be every 2 loops, so every 100 milliseconds, it executes this, it sends over the location, basically. Every time something moves, it sends over an on-relocated packet with information about it. So this means that it receives the X position and Y position of the move, as well as the map, but we don't use that. And we find the old position, and then we find the new position. So the old position is where it relocated from, which is PX and PY, and then the new position is its current position. So instead of showing it instantly teleport, it shows it lerping, which is linear interpolation, from the old position to the new position. And this is a rate decided here by the FPS delay, or what we call the FPS delay, which is essentially, to put it as simply as I can, a way to dynamically change how fast it's lerping depending on lag. So this formula I wouldn't take for yourself if you're planning on using this, and I'm not saying that because I'm jealous of it or something, or I'm envious of, or possessive. It's just because this took so much tweaking to find out was right, and it's very unlikely that yours will work functionally the same. So just something to consider. It is clamped because I don't want it to overshoot or undershoot, and here we're just making sure that they exist, and if so, then we're lerping the position, because the X position and the Y position on the client side don't actually change anything server side. So just because it's in an X position, if it's right on top of a player on the client side but not on the server side, it won't care, because it only generates or checks for collisions on the server side, if that makes sense. So that is today's code showcase. I hope you guys enjoyed. It has been a huge one. It's 30 minutes. It has winded me, but I hope you guys enjoyed. It is not that complicated, I don't think. This is actually a little bit better than the health one, I would say. Just a lot more to take in overall. So, I hope you guys enjoyed. If you enjoyed Zaz, feel free to let me know. But, other than that, I think we're good. I'll probably upload another one. If this is uploaded on Friday or Saturday, I'll be uploading one next week. If this is uploaded on Wednesday, then another one will probably be uploaded either Saturday or maybe Monday or Tuesday, or rather Tuesday or Wednesday again. I'm not sure. Anyway, I digress. I hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you guys look forward to the next one. Have a good day. Bye.